First of all, I'd be talking about what's there in my presentation, because the content that is in my paper and the content that is in my presentation is really correlated, but this is the background of how Anglo-Indian women were represented in colonial writing. This background is in my PPT. So first of all, what is colonial writing? That it can be viewed in many ways, a part of political propaganda for justifying the empire and creating a myth of racial superiority, or as the record of an unusual confrontation of cultures abroad as exotica with commercial potential in terms of readership at home. The literary discourse of imperialism was a crucial part of the cultural representation of the British in India for the consumption of those at home, and also served as a justification for their presence in India. I'd also like to say that few minutes, 10 minutes, I would be talking about my PPT, and the rest of 10 minutes I'd be talking about my paper. So Anglo-Indian literature, next slide please. Anglo-Indian literature to some extent was a record of British colonial history, first painted in glowing terms by writers like Rudyard Kipling and Flora Annie Steele, and then critically by E.M. Forster and Thomson Edward, mirroring the changing attitudes. The shift in sensibility and reaction from the kind of literature that Kipling wrote, a spontaneous celebration and mythicizing of imperialism, to a liberal democratic critique of the colonial system as represented by Forster, reflects not just the individual writer's personal and political commitment, but also proves that ideology is always a shaping factor in colonial writing. Herbert Stark, the Anglo-Indian historian, claimed that the decision to support marriages between British soldiers in those days and Indian women made the British directly responsible for the results of a deliberate policy of bringing into being a mixed population which would be loyal to them. Christopher Hawes sees the economic and social travails of the community as the outcome of an inexorable process of change. He draws attention to the extent to which Anglo-Indians overlapped with the British during the colonial period. The Anglo-Indians were an unwelcome and visible reminder of the complexity of the political, racial, cultural, and sexual transactions that characterized the colonial experience for both the colonizer and the colonized. Chinua Achebe, what he said is that is reported to have remarked that stories define us. Literature, despite or perhaps because of its subjectivity, remains one of the most vivid and easily accessible means of acquiring, disseminating, and processing information about a people, a society, or a community. Not only is it a powerful medium of cultural self-expression and a means of assessment and representation of a society by outsiders, but it also acts as a material force in the formation of class and gender distinctions. Stories, myths, and ideas portrayed in fiction are not just mechanistic reflections of social reality, but metaphorical representations of it. Its social character makes literature partisan, especially in a society with rigidly demarcated classes. I'd like to quote Yujua Thiongo. A writer, after all, comes from a particular class and race and nation. He himself is a product of an actual social process. A writer is trying to persuade us to make us view not only a certain kind of reality, but also from a certain angle of vision often, though perhaps unconsciously on behalf of a certain class, race, or nation. During the colonial period, race relations were constantly re-articulated in response to external developments which influenced discursive representations of all the inhabitants of the colonial space. The history and the very existence of the Anglo-Indian community were inextricably linked to these socio-political formations, which also influenced its imaging in contemporary literature. In order to study the development of the image frequently assigned to the Anglo-Indian woman, it therefore becomes imperative to take into account the psychological impact of racial confrontations. It is also necessary to consider the exigencies of colonial rule, which influence the evolution of a racially inferior as well as morally and culturally deficient stereotype. The conflation of race, class, and gender also influenced the negative imaging of Anglo-Indian women, many of whom belonged to the economically and socially marginalized class of barrack wives. Due to economic difficulties, many of them had to work for their living at a time when there was a discursive valorizing of the purity and domesticity associated with the housebound middle-class woman. Their hybridity, cultural differences, and impoverished status inflected constructions of the women in the community. With the passage of time, attitudes towards race hardened, and slowly even respectable and prosperous Anglo-Indians came to be viewed merely as objects of a grudging patronage which permitted no incursions into the privileges of the rulers. The Anglo-Indian women who shared the religion, the language, and many of the social habits of the British had the potential to breach the walls of privilege and exclusivity which the colonials had erected around themselves. Her ambivalent position in colonial society threatened the maintenance of the divide between the self and the other, which was the basis of the colonizers' assumption of moral authority and its justification for the empire. The Anglo-Indian, as portrayed in literature by authors who spoke from a position of colonial superiority, was thus endowed with certain negative traits. These were seen as being inherent in her blood due to her native connection, rather than as the products of cultural and social circumstances. Many of the novels written by the British in India during the days of colonial confidence were novels of manners rather than psychological novels, novels in which patterns of behavior were carefully observed and recorded, and in which penetrative introversion was of secondary importance. Stereotypes were often used as defense mechanisms to maintain and support the existing status quo. Indian English fiction written in the early years of the 20th century portrays most working women as either Anglo-Indian or Christian, rarely depicting the middle-class Indian women in such a role. Meena Shirvadkar's comment, perhaps the writers though thought the Eurasian and the Christian woman more amenable to the romantic setup of the novel, also reveals some of the cultural underpinnings which impacted the portrayal of the Anglo-Indian woman in Indian literature. Stereotypes are symbols of identification which are positioned within the ethnic and status structure of a society. Anglo-Indians have most frequently been identified and located in literature through perceptions influenced by the racial class and power affiliations of the authors. In the absence of significant creative work from within the community, imaginative literature written by outsiders became a significant means of forming an image of the men and women of the community. This permitted the projection of a selective and biased representation as the only reality, and creative writers, both Indian and British, and even more creative critics from all over the world, imagined that what it is to be Anglo-Indian, and let their fantasies run riot in painting the Anglo-Indian character in the worst colors possible. The word imaging, as my title is the imaging of the Anglo-Indian woman in colonialist literature, what the term imaging means. The verb imaging accords an active role to the other. Imaging implies projection, reflection, imitation, and the act of symbolizing. It is an imposition and has an element of control, the authority. It confers a certain degree of passivity on the subject which is cast in an image, the active role being bestowed upon the image caster. In the perceptions of themselves, Anglo-Indian women demonstrate a refusal to adhere to the dominance of binary oppositions. They explain their values and lives not in terms of binaries but as independent agents. They acknowledge their racial hybridity and grasp the moral opportunity to create their lifestyles. They resist complete identification with the Indian and with the British and claim their own space and subjectivity. Now I'd like to talk about my paper, finally coming to the content. Canon Cole once remarked that what strikes me very much is the ingenuity in word and phrase Anglo-Indian which has been expended in describing the dreadfulness of their characters. This opinion is echoed by Frank Anthony in his book, Britain's Betrayal of India, The History of the Anglo-Indian Community, which claims that the Anglo-Indian community has been perhaps one of the most misrepresented people in the former British Empire. Anglo-Indians have indeed been encumbered with the burden of an identity and a past that shaped their destiny, as well as the situation in which they have been and are sometimes even today perceived and represented by others. It is a past that was created in histories, travelogues, biographies, official documents, and perhaps most of all in literature. This enormous body of work has imposed the tyranny of the written word on identities and events. It has also influenced their subsequent interpretation by writers who often lack the requisite empathy or understanding. Isiel de Solapool ascribes dependence upon stereotypes to a resistance towards a constant re-evaluation of experience, as well as to the fact that they often form the core of our personal tradition, the defenses of our position in society. It is evident that during the colonial period, the imaginative reflection of complex historical and social phenomena in fiction was also frequently linked with the justification of empire and the maintenance of power. In India, the classic binary opposition between us and them was complicated, not merely by a symbiotic socio-cultural interaction between the two races, but also by the physical presence of the Anglo-Indian, who had the potential to blur the lines of demarcation between the rulers and the ruled. The Anglo-Indians were an unwelcome and visible reminder of the complexity of the political, racial, cultural, and sexual transactions that characterized the colonial experience for both the colonizer and the colonized. The growing presence of the community made it difficult for the rulers to occupy the moral high ground, which they gradually attempted to assign to themselves as they consolidated their political hegemony over the subcontinent. Class perceptions and divisions also played a significant role in determining responses to the community, as is indicated by the currency of the belief that God made the native, but Tommy made the Eurasian. The gradual proliferation of negative images of the Anglo-Indian woman in colonial literature reflects the progressive social, economic, and political marginalization of the respective community. It also reveals the subtle yet significant manner in which gender impacted perceptions of racial alterity and cultural superiority. Like other female inhabitants of the colonized space, Anglo-Indian women were evidently affected by racial, social, and cultural discrimination in ways that was substantially distinct from men. And this difference was reflected in their imaging in colonialist literature. Pejorative images of Anglo-Indian women, which are first encountered in late 19th century writing, became the stereotypical norm in the 20th century novels of Henry Bruce, Maud Diver, Ethel Savvy, Effie Penny, and other writers of what Alec Bohemer calls colonialist literature. One of the earliest of these, A Survey of Anglo-Indian Fiction by Bhupal Singh, draws attention to the presence of Anglo-Indian protagonists in colonial novels published until the 1930s. The title of the relevant chapter, Novels of Mixed Marriages and Eurasian Life, indicates a substantial engagement on the part of these authors with themes related to race and the crossing of racial boundaries. This preoccupation inevitably influenced depictions of the community in literary discourses. Singh enumerates the stereotypical characteristics with which Anglo-Indians were often invested in popular colonialist literature, but he does not attempt to critique or analyze the growth of such images. Other critics, including M.A. Naik, Gomti Narayan, and Kai Nicholson, who discuss the imaging of the community in literature, also focus primarily on British writers. Kathleen Cassitti's analysis of Bhavani Junction by John Masters reveals an acceptance of a multiracial identity, as well as a significant reappraisal of perceptions of appropriate feminine behavior and morality within the community itself. Dolores Mam, on the other hand, contests gender characterization of the Anglo-Indian women, which she feels are at worst untrue and at best exaggerated. Her project of rehabilitation and deconstruction is circumscribed by specific engagement with the image of the Anglo-Indian whore, which is merely one component of a complex stereotype, and by its attempt to challenge the factual basis of this image. However, her consideration of the social and cultural compulsions which contributed to such perceptions is very significant. She also questions representations of the indigent reality of many Anglo-Indians as the only reality, thus challenging essentializing images of her community. The portrayal of the women of the community in literature of empire, written during the early years of the 20th century, therefore, frequently combines the best and the worst of them in a pejorative homogeneity based on their belonging to an ethnic group. Many of the novels written by the British in India during the days of colonial confidence were novels of manners rather than psychological novels, in which patterns of behavior were carefully observed and recorded, and in which penetrative introversion was of secondary importance. Anglo-Indian women portrayed in post-colonial literature continues to be defined in terms of their ambivalent positioning within society, as well as their conformity with or variance from discursive notions of sexual purity, fidelity, and morality. However, the texts are no longer shaped by what Alison Sainsbury calls a prevailing social anthropology suitable to aims of imperialism. Referring to the portrayal of Anglo-Indians in literature, Reginald Maher states, if the Eurasian has been consistently painted as the veritable scum of the earth, it is by pens from the West, some of which have standing as English literature. While it is significant that Indian writers and authors rarely slander the Anglo-Indians, it is almost impossible to read an English author who has a good word for these people. His contention is supported by Cedric Dover, who feels that while the concept of white superiority is emphasized in many Western novels, Indian writers like M.R. Anand satirize the half-caste without being motivated by the petty desire to vilify a people. In Saadat Hasan Manto's short story Boo, the narrator Randhir refers to Christian girls who were used to having brief affairs just for the fun of it or because it was the fashion to do so. Randhir is piqued by their inaccessibility as many of them had joined the Women's Auxiliary Force during the war and showed great interest in the white soldiers. In another story, Mummy, there is a perceptible contrast between the respectable traditional bhabis and Anglo-Indian girls who occupy the periphery of the vacuous and dissipated world of films. Dolores Mam claims that in the works of Manto and Ismat, Anglo-Indian women are portrayed positively and there is an attempt to emphasize their admirable qualities. However, Manto's portrayal of Christian or Anglo-Indian girls as being casually promiscuous illustrates the manner in which stereotypes positioned in society's ethnic and status structure receive discursive reinforcement despite the absence of any simplistic moral judgment. Ismat Chughta's novel, The Crooked Line, again makes no clear distinction between a Christian and an Anglo-Indian in its delineation of one of the protagonists, Alma. She could be either, and her independent behavior just reinforces the difference between her and Shaman, who is very conscious of remaining pure despite her various relationships, infatuations, and refusal to conform to conventional norms of behavior. Notwithstanding the porosity of community at various levels, its cultural differences and predilection for privileging its Western heritage ensured its visibility. The image of the sexually promiscuous Anglo-Indian woman was thus reinforced by the fact that her relative freedom of choice and behavior set her apart from the traditional Indian woman, while her intermediate position in society left her open to critical scrutiny. The imaging of Anglo-Indian women, despite certain lapses into time-worn representations, has also been impacted by socio-cultural modifications in acceptable norms of female behavior in India. The creation of negative iconographies of Anglo-Indian women in colonial fiction and in Indian writing in English has been significantly influenced by a concern for defending those political, racial, and social borders, which were perceived as defining these diffuse and complex cultures. The imaging of Anglo-Indian women in literary discourses during the 20th century has been impacted by the creation and imposition of stereotypes by outsiders, as well as by the community's growing acceptance of hybridity, which frequently manifests itself in a desire to challenge existing definitions. Tabish Khair points out that no production of knowledge can ignore the author's involvement as a human subject in his own circumstances. There is an evident and undeniable difference between external perceptions of Anglo-Indian women and those of the community itself. Early portrayals emphasize eternal manifestations of cultural difference, which are often interpreted as tropes of racial inferiority. Gradually, the emphasis shifts to the Anglo-Indian women's potential to disrupt those lines of segregation between the races, which it must be conceded were always more clearly demarcated in literature than in life. I'd like to conclude. The growing field of Anglo-Indian studies asserts a complex and cohesive perception of ethnicity and identity, which takes into account the economic, racial, and regional stratifications present within the community. On themes related to all Anglo-Indian women, exhibit a confident assertion of individuality and a recognition of the ambiguity of the theoretical space they occupy, even within discourses of femininity. Ironically, as Erica Lewin points out, it is their very hybridity, racial, historical, and cultural, which they increasingly use to define and demarcate their own space. Lee Maracle says being a writer is getting up there and writing oneself onto everyone's blackboard. This is from I Am Women. Despite the significantly different perceptions of cultural and social alliances, which often mark the works of Anglo-Indian women living in India and those who belong to the diaspora, they all exhibit a desire to confront the past, to challenge the imposition of pejorative images, and to write new literary definitions for themselves. Thank you.